Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of PB Reads the Bible. I'm PB, Pastor Brian, the pastor here at Christ United Methodist Church in Waynesboro. And PB Reads the Bible is this time that we spend together looking at the Bible, reading from the Bible, and where I share some comments about the passage based on various commentaries and resources that I have read recently and over the years, as well as at least occasionally some of my personal insights. I don't know what number this is along our total series, but it is episode 8 on our journey through First Corinthians. Now, for you, this is 9 o'clock on Monday morning, October 3rd. For me, it's 6:20 on Sunday afternoon, October 2nd, because I have a meeting in Gettysburg while you'll be watching this. I'll be at that meeting, and I can't be in two places at the same time, nor can I do this from there. So this is a long chapter. This is episode 8. We're looking at chapter 7, which is a pretty long chapter, and I've only got a half an hour. So I'm going to jump right into it. However, even though I'm not here with you live, doesn't mean you shouldn't go ahead and check in using the comment section of the stream. Leave questions or comments about the video, the reading for today, and share your joys and concerns for multiple reasons. First of all, you can see each other's comments, questions, and joys and concerns, and in that way we can keep each other lifted in prayer. And I will be going in later a couple times to see what you're saying and what's going on. But let's get to it, shall we? Chapter 7. I'm going to read the first 7 verses and then take a pause and talk about it. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman, but because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one against one another, except perhaps by agreement, and then come to for agreement. Let me start that verse over. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement, for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This I say by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind. Pause. So what's going on here? First, this starts off with Paul saying it's because of a letter. It's a reply to a letter. Then we see this maxim, a maxim. They've got another maxim there. It is well for a man not to touch a woman. It seems that the Corinthians have come up with this maxim, perhaps based on Paul's teachings about himself. Paul, in different places, not only here in this book, but in other places, speaks of himself as being celibate in his ways and abstaining. And he does seem to show that as the ideal. The Corinthians seem to have taken this description of the self-description of Paul's, turned it into a maxim, and universalized it, saying that all should fall into the same thing. Since it's a maxim, Paul can't directly contradict it, but he can alter it. He can qualify it, and he qualifies it right away because of cases of sexual immorality. It would be better for a man to have a wife and a woman to have a husband than for them to fall into sexual immorality, porneia. So there seems also to be a connection back to that earlier one about the guy who was living with his stepmother. notice a couple things about this. I think Paul gets a bad rap. I think Paul gets a bad rap. They say that he, was like a misogynist, that he hated women or something like that, and very pushing back on women and women's rights and all that. Paul was progressive in many ways. There are one or two places in Paul that can be seen as um, non-equal in Paul, but they also seem to perhaps, at least perhaps, have been uh, what's the word? Things that other people wrote and stuck into Paul's writings. Okay. We can see here that Paul is giving this basically the same instructions to men and women, and is speaking very clearly of women. And yeah, he says women don't have charge of their own bodies, the husband does. But he also says the men don't have the charge of their own bodies, the woman does. He's saying the same thing to both. Why is he doing this? What is he saying? He's saying what he says there. Don't withhold. He's telling them don't withhold these conjugal rights from each other. Men, you owe it to your wives. Wives, you owe it to your husbands. Something like that. Okay, don't withhold it, except by an agreement between the two. Otherwise, and only for a set period of time. Otherwise, your passions may be inflamed too much, and you'll sink into sexual immorality. Okay. He does say that I wish that all were like me. There he seems to be lifting up that ideal of abstinence, of celibacy, but he very clearly says not all can accomplish it, because he sees that as a gift, and he uses that word charismata. So a spiritual gift, a gift from God, and he has it, and not all people do. Okay. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Next section, and just one verse, two verses actually. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried, as I am. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. Pause. First of all, we should not, that first one, it says to the unmarried and the widows. That unmarried actually shouldn't be translated unmarried, because Paul very specifically and clearly speaks about unmarried later on, just regular single people. Here, it seems to actually indicate widowers. Okay, we can say that for a couple different reasons. One is, like I said, he talks very specifically about single people in a few more verses a little bit later in this chapter. Second, he speaks directly to widows, and he uses very clearly the Greek word for widows. But I don't think there's a Greek word for widower. Maybe there, so it seems that here he's speaking about widowers and widows. Okay, people who were married but lost their spouses to death. And he says, if you can remain unmarried, but by all means, go ahead and get married. Otherwise, the flames of passion may kill you and drive you to porneia. Next two verses. To the married, I give this counsel, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does separate, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. Pause. Okay. So a couple things about this passage. A lot has been written and said that, Paul must be saying that only men can divorce their wives, but a woman could separate from her husband. That's not true, and that's not what Paul is saying here. When he says separate, about a woman separating from her husband, we very clearly should read that also as divorce. There's a couple things going on here. First, Paul is a rhetorical speaker, and rhetorical style required that you not use repetitive words, that you not use the same word over and over and over and over and over again. When at all possible, you should use a different word. You should use a synonym. And so Paul clearly is using separate as a synonym for divorce. Okay, we are putting our legal understandings of separation and divorce onto Paul and onto first century Roman culture when they didn't have those same legal understandings of separation and divorce. Very clearly, Paul is using an equal term, divorce and separate. Just read them both as divorce if that makes it simpler for you. Now, Hebrew tradition said a man, and Jesus speaks about it, about a man divorcing his wife, and virtually for any reason. She burnt the pot roast, but that a woman couldn't divorce her husband. But Roman law said a woman could divorce her husband. And Corinth is a Roman colony. It is part of the empire and falls under Roman law, which would allow women to divorce their husband. And Roman law also did not have that idea of separate and kind of a differentiation between separate and divorce. So Paul is very clearly speaking about divorce, but don't do it based on, and this is based on what Jesus said. But he also says, if it happens, it happens. If it happens, it happens. Continuing on. Paul's continuing about marriage and divorce, but with a different. See, though that part there is specifically about believers. He is speaking clear. He is speaking only to believers, married believers. Next, he speaks about people who are believers but are married to unbelievers. Should they stay married? Should they divorce? Well, let's read what Paul says. To the rest, I say, in other words, to those who are married to unbelievers, I and not the Lord. Pause. Interesting. Paul quotes, but basically, well, it doesn't quote, but relies on Jesus's teaching for that first one. He says, not I, but the Lord says this about divorce. But here, this is something he knows. And Paul's dead before the Gospels are written, so he's not going by that. But the stories of Jesus's teachings must have been part of an oral tradition, and Paul knew them enough to know what he said about divorce. And he knows that Jesus doesn't directly address this particular issue, but he's going to. So he says, this is me, not the Lord saying this. So let me start it over. To the rest, I say, I, and not the Lord, that if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called you. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. Pause. Interesting. So Paul gives some different stuff here, but only mildly different, moderately different. He still is encouraging not divorcing. He's encouraging staying together, even though they're unbelievers, as long as the unbelievers are willing to stay married to you. And this is kind of the opposite of earlier when Paul says, oh, you got a sin in your group and you got to cut it out, incise it, and get it out of there. Otherwise, the small amount of yeast is going to contaminate and destroy the whole thing. Whereas here, Paul is almost saying the opposite. The grace that the believers have been given through God is an amazingly super active yeast that might then contaminate the unbelievers and make them holy and make them holy. And he speaks about the children being holy. Now remember, holy means set apart by God and for God. So making them right for God. Right? If they're willing to stay together. But if they're not, then let them go. Why? Because God has called you for peace. It is to peace that God has called you, and you would be offering peace by allowing the divorce, by offering the divorce. But in both cases, a believer married to a believer and a believer married to an unbeliever, in there, Paul is also saying that if a divorce happens, a divorce happens. They're still part of the community. They're still part of the community. Okay. The church community, the community of faith. All right. Now Paul moves. Paul shifts gears. Why does he do this? He goes into speaking of Jew, Greek, slave, free. Ooh, sound familiar? Yeah. Paul says it again. What it seems to be is Paul, another rhetorical device. Paul is stating something that they already know to be true, and then using it as a comparison, an analogy, allowing them to make their own connections to what Paul is really talking about. Okay, so it's an aside almost. Yes, it's a digression. He digresses. Oh boy, I never do that. But he digresses for that purpose, picking up from there. However that may be, let each of you live the life that the Lord has assigned, to which God called you. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but obeying the commandments of God is everything. Let each of you remain in the condition in which you were called. Pause. I know it's an interruption. But the Corinthians aren't having the same issue that the Galatians had. The Galatians were having a major issue about circumcision and uncircumcision, about circumcision and uncircumcision. Those two things. Now the Corinthians aren't having that problem with the two. Paul's probably already addressed this issue with them and given them good teachings on it. And this is just a reminder to bring that to the forefront as and allow them make the connections to the other things that he's saying. Picking up from there, were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. Even if you can gain your freedom, make use of your present condition now more than ever. For whoever was called in the Lord as a slave is a freed person belonging to the Lord, just as whoever was free when called is a slave of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human masters. In whatever condition you were called, brothers and sisters, there remain with God. Pause. So Paul says, if a slave can gain his freedom, go ahead and do it. That is like the preferred thing. But if not, don't worry about it. Remain as you are, because you belong to God. You belong to Christ, and you are God's slave. And therefore, you are free from the world. You are a freed person belonging to the Lord. Ooh. And again, he uses that bought with a price, which we talked about the other day. Don't think about it as far as, Jesus's substitutionary atonement or whatever. This is slave language. Slave language. You've been bought with a price. You're not to be free, but to be a slave to Christ. Christ is your master. Continuing. Counsel for the unmarried. Now, Paul turns back to this issue of marriage and divorce and sexuality. And Paul addresses the unmarrieds, all the unmarrieds. And when Paul says virgins, he's not necessarily talking about virgin, but unmarried woman. And again, it's that whole not using the same term thing. Now, concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the impending crisis, it is well for you to remain as you are. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you do not sin. And if a virgin marries, she does not sin. Yet those who marry will experience distress in this life, and I would spare you that. Pause. That part there in verse 26, it is well for you to remain as you are, really shouldn't be left as part of that, even though it is in both the NIV and the NRSV. That's a maxim. It's in the Greek, it's written as Paul stating this as his maxim. I say this to you, it is well for you to remain as you are. And this impending crisis, he's a little vague about. We're going to find out next what he's talking about. But he's saying, if you're unmarried, stay unmarried. If you're unmarried, stay unmarried. Don't strive after finding a wife or a husband. Remain as you are. But if you marry, don't sin. And those who marry will experience distress in this life. And I'm just trying to save you that. Paul's okay, what is the impending crisis Paul is talking about? He's talking about the second coming. He's talking about the eschaton and the end times and the apocalypse of the world that was ushered in by Jesus's birth, life, death, and resurrection. And he thought all of this, the parousia, was going to be taking place like tomorrow. So he said, you know what? If you're unmarried, stay unmarried. Stay unmarried. Continuing. And here he's very clear. I mean, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short. There we go. That's apocalyptic language. From now on, let even those who have wives be as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. Pause. What is Paul saying there? These structures and these relationships, as if the world and everything was passing away, as if they had little value or meaning, because of the importance of being with God and being part of being connected to Christ and remaining holy in it. Although it's weird that he says that about having a wife be as though they had none. Continuing, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried woman and the virgin are anxious about the affairs of the Lord, so that they may be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please her husband. I say this to your own benefit, not to put any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. Pause. And there where he's talking about virgin, I believe he's talking about, oh no, sorry, still just single women, right? All the single ladies, all the single ladies. But to be focused, to be undivided because time is short. Because time is short. But if you're married, you're going to have divided, and you should. And you should. Paul would totally understand that and get that. Continuing from there, 36 to 38. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his fiancée, your translation may say virgin, but it really means fiancée, betrothed. If his passions are strong, and so it has to be, let him marry as he wishes. It is no sin. Let them marry. But if someone stands firm in his resolve, being under no necessity, but having his own desire under control, and has determined in his own mind to keep her as his fiancée, he will do well. So then, he who marries his fiancée does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do better. Pause. Paul's saying, don't let passion control you. And if you think passion is going to control you and lead you towards that porneia, go ahead and marry your fiance, your betrothed. That's not a sin. It's not a sin to get married, Paul says. If you go ahead and get married to her, you're doing well. But if you can refrain from it, and if you can control yourself, then you will do even better. You will do even better. And the last two verses. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, and if the husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, only in the Lord. But in my judgment, she is more blessed if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Pause. End of chapter. What's Paul saying? Paul is saying that after death, if a woman chooses to, after her husband's death, if a woman chooses to get married, she can, but she doesn't have to. She doesn't have to. Anyway, my friends, that's it for today. That's it for today. We got it in under the wire. Whew, awesome. I do pray that this has been beneficial, that you've learned something or relearned something from it. We will be back at this tomorrow, Tuesday, October 4th, live at 9 a.m. I pray this is beneficial as you go about your days, not just today, but every day. Keep those eyes and ears open to everything that our living, loving God, active God is doing in your life and in the lives of those around you. When you see it, when you hear it, say, thank you, Papa, and then tell somebody about it. Till we meet again, my friends, be blessed. Be blessed. Bye.